So with 9th edition shaping up and some big changes for the Space Marine faction on the horizon, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the Space Marine chapters available today that you can play and talk about their power rankings in relation to one another, as well as go over some of the reasons that each of these chapters is powerful in its own right. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about some Space Marines. Now, obviously, this video comes just before the big ol' Space Marine changes that we're expecting in October, so I think it would be fun to talk about the balance of the various Space Marine chapters currently, and especially see how that would change come the new Space Marine Codex. Now, today I'm just going to be talking about the Space Marine chapters that fit into the Space Marine Codex mechanics. Basically, any Adeptus Astartes keyworded subfaction that uses the Combat Doctrines ability. So today we're not going to be talking about Grey Knights. They have their own thing. They don't use Combat Doctrines. And I'm not going to be talking about any of the Chaos Space Marine factions or anything like that. I'm also going to be focusing only on the chapters that have their own codex or supplement. So some of the minor ones like Blood Raven, or the Forge World chapters like Red Scorpions or Minotaurs. I guess we'll do a little bit of a shout out to those at the end, but those aren't going to be included in the basic rankings. We're just going to be using the ones that you can see right here for this one. Now, before we get into it, I think it's important to talk about the 9th edition format as a whole, because that's going to inform a lot of how we build this tier list. Almost above anything else, 9th edition really rewards resilience in your ability to fight on central objectives and stay put and outlast your opponent. That said, you also have to have the damage output to be able to push through your opponent's army and kill all of their forward objective holders. So a combination of those two attributes is usually where we're going to be at to be a very strong powerhouse faction in 9th edition. And as we complete this tier list and we talk about some of the statistics that we're already seeing for the different Space Marine chapters, I think that's going to become pretty apparent. There are a couple other mechanics that are rewarded by 9th edition. I think the number one that I can think of off the top of my head is the ability to heroically intervene. So factions like Blood Angels, like Space Wolves, and to a lesser extent like Black Templars all have the ability to move in to combat outside of the normal charge phase, and that's a very important ability because that lets you fight more consistently for objectives. If your opponent comes in to contest with objective secured models, they can't really do it and be safe from your heroic intervention, especially a 6-inch one, using either Devout Push from the Black Templar specifically, or the heroic intervention stratagems that Blood Angels and Space Wolves have access to. Now, we did a faction ranking video, obviously, a couple weeks ago, and I think we shortchanged some of these Space Marine subfactions. And one of the things that we didn't think about during that video was that a lot of the power of Space Marines doesn't come from the individual strengths of each faction. So, for example, especially the Codex factions like Blood Angels or Space Wolves have their own bevy of powerful, unique units, but whether or not those are powerful doesn't really matter quite as much as the units that are shared between all of the Space Marine factions. A lot of the raw power of Space Marines comes from their breadth of selections, especially in the Forge World category, because not only do those things not typically get balanced to the same level of rigor that the Codex entries do, but also they're available basically across the board. So, basically, right now, Relic Contemptors and Landspeeder Tempests are sort of the gold standard for damage output in the game, and both of those are available to, I think, basically all of these factions. So one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these Space Marine chapters is that in terms of a holistic ranking of all of the Space Marine chapters, these are all going to be in probably A to S tier. Where we rank them independently is going to be just in comparison to one another, but basically any Space Marine faction right now in the game can go in and build a list that looks pretty similar, uses the Combat Doctrines ability, uses some of its own abilities to create some flavor and some, powerful interactions, but, basically comes in with the core Space Marine stat line and mechanics, which are extremely powerful right now. So even if I rank your favorite chapter down in the low category here, don't take that as me telling you that they're bad. I think they're just probably not as good as in comparison to some of the top tier stuff on this list. So with those caveats out of the way, way, let's get started. And what I'm going to do is get started with the supplement chapters. So these are the chapters that use the core Space Marine rulebook, or the core Space Marine Codex, but also use their own chapter supplement. And I'm going to be including in these any successor chapters that use the same supplement to create their chapters. So if you're using one of these chapters as the template chapter for your successor, they're basically going to fall into the category, probably a pretty similar category to their parent chapter. First up, we have Ultramarines. Now, Ultramarines have one unique ability that is not seen basically anywhere across the Space Marine codexes, and one of the most powerful abilities in the game right now, and that's strategic redeployment. So that rapid redeployment stratagem for 2CP lets you redeploy up to 3 Ultramarines units before the start of the game. Now, the reason that that's important is because if you're using the unadulterated GT 2020 mission format, then you will have deployed your army before you know who's going first. That means that you can deploy things aggressively to force your opponent to, deploy around them. And then, if you're not going first, you could pull them back with that rapid redeployment. This is especially important with units like Incursors or Scouts that have concealed position deployment, so that they can deploy up ahead of your army. They can force your opponent's forward deployers back. And then, even if you go second, you can rapid redeploy them back into your deployment zone and keep them safe so you're not losing any units for that trade. You can also, alternatively, if you win the roll to go first on a defensive deployment, you can then push your aggressive units way far forward. It's just a really super powerful ability in the current format. That format might change if the community moves to a full deployment style, but that said, it's still going to be pretty good to have. And more than anything, it's going to really reward smart players who can make the best use of that ability. Unfortunately, other than that, and a couple other benefits, like you have access to the Seal of Oath, which is very powerful. However, the focus of the game is changing from big Death Star units to a more MSU style, so even that isn't going to be quite as important. The Ultramarine characters were one of the big focuses of the faction when they originally released, and unfortunately, they've just, after a couple nerfs and just changes to the core mechanics, they don't quite pull their weight as much as they did. For example, Gilliman is really super powerful, and we see him in a lot of lists. However, the inability to reroll his respawn 4+ for his armor is a big hit. Things like Tigurius's -1 to hit effect that he can put on your units is less effective now that you can only stack -1 to hit up to a -1, so they can basically just advance and shoot assault weapons for free if you do that. Cassius's ability to recite 2 litanies a turn was very powerful when the Codex released, but since Psychic Awakening, every faction has access to that, and rerollable litanies, which Cassius can't do. So a lot of sort of little micro nerfs that have really hurt Ultramarines in the grand scheme of things. I think I'm going to put them towards the bottom tier. We're going to put them in this okay category, if only for the that rapid redeployment strat. Next up, we have Black Templars. This is a really interesting one. We haven't really seen Black Templars do much on the tabletop so far. They were released in White Dwarf, and since then didn't really get a fair shake, I think. I mentioned before that Heroic Intervention style abilities, which the Black Templars specifically have in their Devout Push stratagem, which, unlike Heroic Intervention, which is interesting, lets them just straight up consolidate into an enemy unit at the start of the fight phase, either your fight phase or your opponent's fight phase. So it is even a little bit more flexible than a standard Heroic Intervention, because there's basically no counterplay. You can do it in your own charge phase, or in your own fight phase if you want. And this ability has a bunch of different applications. You can use it to stop your opponent from being charged if you don't want to trigger Overwatch or any effects that trigger uncharged like Shock Assault. You can use it, again, like a Heroic Intervention to get your models into melee in your opponent's turn. There's a bunch of different uses for it. It itself is also not a Heroic Intervention, which has its own upsides and downsides. It doesn't make you targetable by chargers, so unless the target declared a charge on your unit, you still cannot be targeted by enemy melee attacks from a charging enemy unit, which is really powerful. That said, it also doesn't trigger Shock Assault, so you don't get your +1 attack or your extra benefits from that. All in all, I think it's a very powerful ability to have, but all told, there isn't much else really holding up the faction. They do have a 1 CP 4+ deny, which is very powerful. They have the ability to stack a little bit of anti-psyker hate in their army with a warlord trait that gives them denies with +1, which is nice. However, they're not going to be quite as good at it as a faction like Space Wolves. And the other benefits that they get from being Black Templars don't really add up, unfortunately. We're going to put them at the bottom category here. I think there is still some play in Black Templars, and they are very tricksy. And the fact that not a lot of people play them is actually pretty good. You can catch people out a lot of times with Black Templars' ability just because of how weird they are, especially that Devout Push. That can really sort of to totally flip games right on their heads if your opponent's not watching out for it. Next up, we have White Scars, and White Scars is an interesting one. I think they're one that everyone sort of expected to be very powerful going into 9th edition, but we're just not seeing them put up the results. And unfortunately, I think that's just sort of how White Scars have been throughout the entirety of their existence. They can get you into melee very quickly, but they don't really do enough to benefit melee to make that matter. They mostly play sort of a combined arms game, just like every other Space Marine chapter, but with the downside that they have no benefit to their range game whatsoever, effectively, and their melee game only really turns on once you get into Assault Doctrine on rounds 3 or 4. Now that the game is shorter, so you have less time to compete for objectives after that Assault Doctrine is active, you actually get even less use out of it. And even though they do have some very powerful abilities, like their Chapter Litany to reroll wounds, as well as Orsaro Khan's Aura to get +1 to wound, those are both very powerful, but I don't think that they pull the faction back from the brink. I think the biggest downside of White Scars is that obviously you're giving up the abilities of playing other very powerful melee chapters like Blood Angels and like Space Wolves without really getting much besides some extra threat range. And while threat range, I think in 8th edition was sort of superlative. You needed to have a long threat range to get through the big long table space in order to compete with your opponent. I just don't think it's necessary anymore. Having the ability to threaten, sort of clear across the table doesn't really matter if you're fighting for objectives that are only 12 inches away from you. We're going to put them in, we're actually going to put them below Ultramarines here. Sorry, White Scars, I think you're cool, and I think you're really sweet, but I just don't think that you quite have a leg to stand on right now. I do think that, obviously, Encirclement is a very powerful stratagem. It lets you reserve units in without having to worry about the strategic reserve restrictions, and in some cases you can do it much more efficiently because it's just 1 CP regardless of what you're dropping in. Doesn't matter what the power level is, but I don't think that alone is enough to hold up the faction. Next up we have Iron Hands, and Iron Hands is an interesting case. Right now Iron Hands seem like they should be the very top of the pack, given that damage output and resilience are sort of superlative right now. Iron Hands basically fall into those categories, and with some of the stats that I'll talk about at the end of the video, we've seen Iron Hands put up pretty good results. The downside is that I think sort of appropriately their game plan is incredibly inflexible. So basically what you're going to be doing with most Iron Hands lists is you're going to build a big brick of infantry. You're going to put Iron Father Fieros in the middle of it to give them a 5+ invulnerable save. You're going to put a Father of the Future, a Master of the Apothecary in the middle of it as well to make all of their 6+ ignores into 5+ ignore wounds, which is extremely powerful. You basically, in a lot of cases, you essentially double the resilience of your models because, for example, if a 2 damage weapon hits an Intercessor, you have 2 30% chances to ignore effectively the entire 2 damage hit because you're going to be reduced down to 1 wound, and then the second 2 damage hit is going to have to kill you. And as you start adding wounds to that unit and you bring in things like Assault Centurions or Aggressors with a big boatload of wounds, that just starts going farther and farther. The downside is that is a combo that's very dependent on sort of 2 characters that are close together. It doesn't spread across the table very well, and I think it's susceptible to being sort of just straight up outplayed. If your opponent is able to run rings around you, you can very quickly, just get caught out and be without the ability to respond very well. And we actually saw this play out in the T5S2 Invitational. We had an Iron Hands list bringing 30 Assault Intercessors alongside that Fieros and Apothecary combo with some artillery in the back to sort of force your opponent to engage into the Assault Intercessors, and Liam Vissel's Harlequins were able to basically just run a ring around this sort of Iron Hands style army. I do think that archetype is still very powerful, and I think it's powerful enough to put it into the pretty good category up here. Probably one of the most successful archetypes in Space Marines right now, but I just don't think it's quite flexible enough to really get it to the top tier. Next up, we're talking about Raven Guard. Raven Guard were sort of the boogeymen of 8th edition with the big Centurion drop list, and I still think the ability to deep strike anything in your army, any infantry in your army, is extremely powerful, especially since we're in an age of Eradicators right now, and being able to infiltrate in Eradicators is like just crazy good. In addition, they also have effectively a redeploy ability, just like Ultramarines do, in that Master of Ambush Warlord trait, which was sort of the cause of much gnashing of teeth in 8th edition. Back in the day, you could Master of Ambush in 6 Assault Centurions or 6 Devastator Centurions if you were going first, and you would just sort of table your opponent top of 1, basically, by putting those guys right outside your opponent's deployment zone. Now you can use it a little little bit more cagely, you can then pull your Master of Ambush and your the unit that he's ambushing with, and redeploy them basically anywhere on the table you want. So whether or not that's putting them on forward objectives, if your opponent doesn't have a lot of indirect fire, you can put things like aggressors, very powerful units like that, up in the front of your opponent's army and hide them if you're not going first. If you are going first, you can just put them in front of your opponent's army and shoot. If your opponent responds to the deployment of your big powerful Death Star unit, you can pull them somewhere else on the table with that Master of Ambush. So they do have a limited amount of redeployment ability. They also have their Infiltrator stratagem to just move before the game starts. So that is also super good. So that is a lesser ability to redeploy, but it still matters and it's still important. And I think both of those together put Raven Guard probably in this mid tier. I think there is an argument to put them up sort of around where Iron Hands are. I'm going to put them in this mid tier for now because they don't really have any ability to increase their resilience or damage out. They're mostly just being tricksy with deep strikes and with the pregame phase and deployment phase stuff. But they can obviously clearly leverage that into just putting themselves in a better position to attack their opponent in the early game. So I do think that they are a strong contender right now. I don't know if they're going to be they're good enough to push up to this top tier, but I do think that in the hands of a good player, our Raven Guard list is really going to rip some people apart. Specifically, you're going to be trying to play like a lot of the Gravis armored stuff. So I think 2 to 3 Eradicator units. I mean, that's good in basically every faction, every Space Marine chapter, but it's very good in Raven Guard because you have the ability to deep strike them. And then also aggressors obviously are incredibly important, not only for that deep strike, but for the ability to Master of Ambush them around the table also. So, and then you can back that up with some of the other powerful sort of Forge World shooting that's available to Space Marines. Next up is Imperial Fists, and Imperial Fists have they have aged poorly, I think, coming into 9th edition. Unfortunately, a lot of the core mechanics of the game have changed such that Imperial Fists aren't super useful anymore. Vehicles can basically no longer gain cover outside of some special abilities. And with that being a case, the Imperial Fists basically are just good at sort of shooting infantry that are in cover, which is fine, but not really a great faction identity to have. Not to mention the fact that if you're playing full Imperial Fists, the changes to the combat doctrines since in the January combat doctrine errata meant that they only got 1 turn of their double damage against vehicles, which, while it's still powerful and it's good if you're playing all the indirect fire stuff, it's typically not enough, especially if your opponent is playing very cagey on the first turn, and it's a little difficult to sort of push through the amount of damage that you need to with that super doctrine. A lot of the Devastator super doctrines just got hammered really hard with that change, which is fair. It's very powerful, but it happens in a phase of the game where your opponent has the most chance to counterplay it, basically. In 9th edition, while having batteries of indirect fire weapons are usually pretty solid, especially since the smaller table lets you reach far back with things like Whirlwind Scorpii, you do run into some very serious issues that you have a tough time competing for the primary objectives, which is where your actual points are scored. So even if you table your opponent, if your opponent was sitting on the majority of the objectives for the entire game, you're going to lose regardless of what happens. And so the sort of core Imperial Fist game plan has, I think, been nerfed pretty heavily. That said, obviously there are Imperial Fist archetypes that are very powerful. Being able to span just intercessors and put a whole bunch of bolters on the table, use their overlapping bolter keywords or their bolter buff abilities to just deal immense damage at that sort of 24-inch range band is obviously a pretty solid archetype. They have the ability to grant obsec to a lot of things, which is very nice. But on the other hand, they sort of lost their buffs to Devastator Centurions with their Devastation Battery. So I think that you win some, you lose some with Imperial Fists. I think I would put them, I guess, above Black Templar, sort of at the bottom category here. I do think that they soup into other factions very well still, because they do ignore cover with those artillery, which is important still. But as a single faction, I'm not sure that Imperial Fists really can compete with the other ones. I think I'm happy to be proven wrong here, but I don't think that Imperial Fists really have what it takes. Next up, we're going into the last of the supplement chapters, and we have Salamanders. And I think based on the results that we've seen so far, even this early into the edition, I'm not really going to surprise anybody by putting Salamanders right at the top. They have been just an absolute powerhouse so far as we've moved into 9th edition. They have incredible resilience. They have a lot of those board control tricks like the heroic intervention, not only with Born Protectors, their stratagem to heroically intervene with a unit if you declare a charge against something else within 12, but they also, their Chapter Litany allows their entire army to heroically intervene 3, which is, it is counterplayable, but it is extremely powerful still. Now with the Justiciar in the faction, there's basically no way to engage into a Salamander's army and force a favorable trade. You have to shoot them apart at range before you go in, and even that's really tough. They have extremely powerful characters. Their warlord traits and relics are some of the most powerful in the faction. They have immense damage output, not only through Crucible of Battle, but also their Super Doctrine to get +1 to wound on their Melta weapons. Turns out that's really good on Eradicators, which are sort of the bee's knees right now. So a lot of the units that are good just fall really well into the Salamander's game plan. They have a lot of MSU style units like Relic Contemptors and like Landspeeder Tempests that benefit from their Master Artisan's chapter tactic. There's also a lot of really big units that benefit from their psychic powers and Crucible of Battle. Things like Aggressors or big Intercessor squads that you're going to be dumping a lot of these like Drake Skin and Fire Shield on. And then using stratagems like the +1 save or Transhuman Physiology to really buff up their survivability through the roof. So honestly, everything that you need to do in 9th edition, which is be very hard to kill, deal immense damage at sort of short range, and have some tricks to win in the combat phase, they do all of them. So it's fine. So yeah, I don't think it's any surprise really that Salamanders are going to be really in the top tier. And right now we're seeing them put out some insane numbers. We'll talk about some win percentages towards the end. Around a 70% win rate for this chapter right now. Just pure, unadulterated insanity. Okay, with that we're going to move into the Codex chapters, and these are the ones that have their own codex, so they're not based out of a supplement or a White Dwarf or anything like that. They have their own codex that they're going to use in place of the Space Marine Codex, but they still use basically a lot of the same mechanics, and like we mentioned before, a lot of those Forge World, really powerful Forge World options are available for these chapters as well, in addition to the standard chapters. So the first up, we have Dark Angels, and the Dark Angels are in a bit of a weird spot right now. Obviously, their faction identity is a little bit confused, to be honest. They are trying to play in a bunch of different realms. They have obviously the Deathwing sub-faction to bring in a bunch of Terminators, Ravenwing to bring faster stuff, and then sort of the standard, just normal Space Marine stuff. They have a focus on plasma weaponry, which is fine. And there are some pretty powerful units that have sort of come to the fore in Dark Angel, especially things like Inceptors who can use weapons of the Dark Age and really blast people with those plasma, the plasma blasters, especially since Inceptors got a big points decrease going into 9th edition, which is very nice for them. Unfortunately, the defensive focus of a Dark Angel's army typically tends to be their Deathwing Terminator style units, and unfortunately, Terminators really just don't cut it right now. While they can play some of the more defensive Primaris stuff, like Gravis Armored stuff, none of their combo abilities work on those style models. They're all based around Deathwing Terminators. And really, just 2 wound models aren't really going to cut it. It'll be interesting to see what happens to this faction once we move into the new Codex era, and a lot of these sort of maligned models get additional wounds tacked onto them to make them a little bit more competitive. That's going to be really interesting. But right now, Dark Angels are really, I think, just being held up by their really incredible characters. Obviously, mostly Talon Masters, honestly. It's just Samael and Talon Masters, which are still insane. They can shoot in combat now, which is really good. They ignore the move and shoot penalty, so you don't have to spend warlord traits on that. Just incredible models, and backing up sort of a standard Space Marine faction. That's really, I think, where Dark Angels live right now, but unfortunately, I don't think that really gets them very far up the chain here. I'm going to put them in okay. We're going to put them around sort of Ultramarines level, but I'm not very impressed by Dark Angels so far. I think they're fine, but I don't think they do really anything special. Next up, we have Deathwatch, and this is probably going to be biased because I think Deathwatch are the coolest, and I love them very much, and I play them all the time, as much as I can anyway. And I've talked about it a lot, but I do think Deathwatch are relatively powerful in this meta. While they don't really do anything to buff the resilience of their army, they do have a lot of those forward deploy abilities between the Beacon Angelus that can pull an infantry unit from anywhere on the table to where a character is, which if you put it on a fast character like a jump pack character, you can really springboard forward a big, dangerous unit of aggressor intercessors or just standard ABR intercessors and play very tricksy that way. You can also use it to pull bottles out of combat, so you can play more aggressively without having to worry about like desperate breakout, and you can still just teleport out of combat and then still shoot, which is very powerful as well. You also just have the ability to teleport anything in the faction, so you can be teleporting eradicators, which is probably where you want to be, or big units of aggressors and things like that. But also their damage output is just through the roof on their standard infantry firearms because of their special issue ammunition. So they're going to be killing basically any equivalent infantry on 2s with their Hellfire rounds. They're going to be blasting through vehicles with really high AP with their other rounds, and being able to sit in tactical doctrine rounds 2 and 3, which is where most of the damage of the game gets put out, and probably are the most important rounds of the game, is really super powerful. So I do think Deathwatch, I think they're probably in this good to pretty good category. I'm biased, so I'm going to put them in pretty good, but probably at the lower end. They're probably somewhere around here between good and pretty good, I think. Around Raven Guard is probably where we want them to be. Next up, we have two very similar factions in Blood Angels and Space Wolves, and I think it's interesting that these two got slotted for last, but it's going to be interesting to talk to them in comparison to one another because they're both very similar, but one of them does a lot better than the other one right now, and the other one's Blood Angels. So let's talk about Blood Angels first. Obviously, their big benefits are just obscene threat range. They can redeploy anything via Deep Strike anywhere on the table. They can get buffs, incredible buffs to their charges. Between an innate +1 to charge, they could supersede that with a Canticle of Hate for +2 to charge, and then they can roll 3 dice for their charge if they're coming out of Deep Strike. So they can basically guarantee any charge out of Deep Strike. The downside is that with the smaller table size, Deep Strikes typically tend to be a little bit less powerful unless your opponent doesn't really have the screens to block you off, in which case, yeah, go wild. You can go get them. But the flip side of that coin is that Blood Angels typically tend to be a little bit on the squishier side. A lot of their elite units, while they're individually very, very resilient, things like Sanguinary Guard are difficult to kill individually, but there's not very many of them, so you just need to kill a couple of them to really neuter the power of that unit. However, they have really good threat range, they have really good damage with their +1 to wound, chapter tactic, and obviously, just like Space Wolves, they both have the ability to heroically intervene anything in their army 6 inches, which is very powerful right now. I think the downside is that resilience. They don't take a punch very well, and a lot of times you can see Blood Angels armies just sort of crash on their opponent, and if they're not able to alpha strike them and really blast them off immediately, they're going to fall apart very quickly. That said, I think I'm going to put Blood Angels around this good category here. I think that their ability to play the melee game is very powerful, and it's very relevant currently in the metagame, but I just think that they rely a little bit too hard on really crushing alpha strikes, which is not really a good place to be at. You know, if you deploy hoping you can alpha and then you go second, your opponent can really punish you for that. They only have a little bit of sort of redeployability. They can Forlorn Fury, a unit of Death Company, basically, and that lets you effectively redeploy them or move them pregame to get into cover if you need it, or to push forward if you need the threat range. But I just don't think that it's that reliable effectively. So a lot of times you're going to run into situations where you're not in an amazing matchup and you just get pushed right out of the scenario. That said, moving on to Space Wolves. Space Wolves, I think we are going to put right up here in the top of the pretty good category. We really shafted Space Wolves in our faction review, and that was totally uncalled for. That was wrong. I'm willing to admit that was that was really wrong. Space Wolves have been putting up insane results so far in the game. I made a whole video in 8th edition about how Space Wolves sort of had this weird kind of confused faction identity, and I think that's still true. One of the issues is that they're this melee faction, but they don't have any threat range increases. They can advance and charge a lot of times, and they can use Canticle of Hate, and that's about it. The upside is that now that all the objectives are in the middle of the table and they're only a couple inches away from your deployment zone, you don't really need to threat that far. So a unit of Wolfen that threats, reasonably 20-ish inches is just fine. You can threaten wherever your opponent's going to be standing on those objectives. You can heroically intervene into them if you need to. You're backed up by all the really powerful Forge World shooting if you need it. And some of the recent includes, obviously, the Judiciary on all of these factions is going to be very powerful for controlling the melee phase. But I think, especially for Space Wolves, which can really cement the resilience of their melee units. You know, they have Wolfen units with a 5+ ignore, with just a bevy of storm shields. They can bring Wolfguard Terminator units with a whole bunch of storm shields. Those have been pretty effective in the past. And they can just bring really strong characters that can, through use of stratagems, can really push their damage output through the roof. So even if you just basic intercessors are delivering those characters, you're with your ability to manipulate the fight phase, those guys can absolutely rip apart entire armies without really breaking a sweat. It's sort of difficult to quantify the exact power of Space Wolves right now, to be honest. They're sort of a jack of all trades faction right now. I think they have a lot of very minor abilities that play well into 9th edition. So while they're not as, tricksy as Raven Guard, and they're not as resilient as Iron Hands, they still do have sort of a level of tricks and resilience, and they don't have quite the same damage output as Blood Angels or White Scars. They have that all to a lesser extent, so they do still have good damage output. They do still have a little bit of tricks in the combat phase. They are relatively resilient, and those individual benefits end up being greater than the sum of their parts because they're not focused on any one single game plan. They can play relatively flexibly and project a lot of threat into the center of the table. Obviously, I think this is a little skewed by the fact that for like a good 2 weeks of the edition, the entire army was objective secured. So I don't know if their results were skewed by that, but as we saw in the T5S2 Invitational, which obviously was won by Space Wolves, they do have the ability to play the melee game almost better than most other factions. And with using resilient units like Impulsors and like Wolfen that have a really strong invulnerable save, they can be strong. They can be resilient enough to stand on those objectives for long, and it's very difficult to engage into them with all of the abilities that they have. So anyway, that's going to be the ranking of the supplement and codex chapters that we have in the game so far. Now, before we wrap up the video, I'd like to do a couple shout outs to some of the lesser played Space Marine chapters, specifically the Forge World ones, those being Red Scorpions, Karkadons, Minotaurs, Raptors, basically. Now, a lot of times if you are playing a successor chapter to any of these, the major supplement chapters, you will want to try to fit your way into one of those sub-faction keywords, one of those chapter keywords, because that gives you access to some powerful special characters, which is nice to have the option of. Minotaurs specifically have access to a couple important ones. I think one of them being Astarion Moloch, who is their Chapter Master. Obviously, he gives you a free Chapter Master if you buy him he's only 140 points, so basically the cost of a standard Smash Captain equivalent. He's very difficult to kill, so he's a good target for While We Stand, We Fight. And while he gives you the old Chapter Master reroll, so reroll failed hits instead of reroll all hits, he does give you that Chapter Master aura for free, and he also gives you reroll charges, which is pretty nice. So I think that's an interesting one to think about. Honorable mention in Minotaurs for Ivanus and Comey, who's their Master of Sanctity. He's actually, interestingly, he's a 5-wound chaplain, so he's basically an interrogator chaplain, but he has the Master of Sanctity buff built in, so you don't have to spend a CP on it. And he does not have, as far as I know, he does not have a preset Warlord trait, so you can give him Master Orator as well. So for just 1 CP for the hero of the chapter, can make him just a standard Master of Sanctity Wise Orator guy if you're in Minotaurs, which is very powerful. Looking at Red Scorpions, there is a bunch of pretty powerful characters for Red Scorpions. I think the number one that everyone talks about is Magister Severin Loth, who has a 6-inch aura of reroll failed wound rolls against Psychers, which is sometimes incredibly useful, especially if your metagame is sort of dominated by the Psyker-heavy factions, things like Grey Knights and Tyranids and Demons and things like that. Sliding this guy into your list, he's already a pretty powerful librarian. He's got 2 casts, 3 denies with a Psychic Hood, which is pretty solid. He has an invulnerable save, which basically no librarians have. He's pretty solid in melee. He's got 6 wounds for some reason. This guy just has everything going for him. But if you want him to get in there and beat up some Psychers, or if you want your army to really kill some Psychers, he's an excellent include if you can slot him in, and you can slot into that Red Scorpions keyword. So those are 2 things to keep in mind, I think, if you're looking at sub-factions to play. And as far as I know, neither of those have a parent chapter that's been specified, so you can play them as any successor. So those are 2 sub-factions that I would consider. Now, I also talked about some stats that we have on the different the meta performances for these chapters. This is from Goonhammer, so big shout out to the Goonhammer crew for putting this meta analysis together. They did this recent article, Go First and Prosper, which I think is a very appropriate name, talking about the first versus second disparity in 9th edition. They looked at 4 different GTs that were held over the last couple weeks, and they got basically the same results that I did in the questionnaire that I sent out in one of my recent videos, which is that there's almost a 60-40 win percentage going first versus going second. So clearly something needs to be done. It's interesting that we're sort of getting those same statistics from multiple sources rather than just the questionnaire that I did, which was inherently unscientific, I will I will admit. But they also had they put some win percentages together for the different Space Marine chapters, so I think that's going to be interesting to talk about. Obviously, all of them pretty close to 50% for the most part. I did mention the Salamander statistic earlier that Salamanders are at a 71% win rate, which is just insanity. That's like close to pre-nerf Iron Hands, if I remember correctly, who are winning. I think they were closer to 80%, which is just silly. But right now, Salamanders, I think probably way too powerful at that 71%. Also at one of the highest meta percentages in the game. We should also talk about that Space Marines are, in general, it says include all of the sub-factions. So I think just all of the supplement sub-factions, but Space Marines are at like probably a 50%, probably close to a 50% faction representation, which is just too high. Like, come on, G-Dub, give us something else. But the breakdown of that, obviously, Salamanders are killing it right now. Iron Hands, they do have this 70% win rate as well. That said, there's only 4 lists, I think, got uploaded, so that's a little bit of a small data set there. I don't know if there's too much you can glean from that. Space Hooves over at 63, and then we see the other ones, Ultramarines, Imperial Fist, Raven Guard, moving down as we go. I think the most interesting one from here, these are all single-digit numbers of results, which isn't, you can't really tell too much from. Blood Angels down at a 48% win rate so far is interesting, and I do think that they are very go first dependent, so that doesn't super surprise me. And then we have Imperial Fist listed twice for some reason, but Black Templars down at 44%, which isn't which isn't that surprising to me. I think the interesting ones, Ultramarines up at a 50-50, which is pretty reasonable. Ultramarines are very jack of all trades, so it could be that they're just pretty solid into the meta, and that they can kind of assuage the second player disadvantage a little bit with that rapid redeployment. So it may be that Ultramarines are a little bit better than I gave them credit for thanks to the rapid redeployment. Space Wolves up at 63%. We'll see if that continues to stay true as the game keeps going, and I would be very interested to see with more results whether this Iron Hands 70% stays put. I do think Iron Hands are, while they're very super powerful in the 9th edition format, I do think that they're a little bit inflexible and that they typically tend to lose to somebody who's just piloting their list better, but they may just be good enough and resilient enough to really force through wins regardless of how the game state plays out. But we're definitely gonna need to see some more Iron Hands results put up before we can really make a determination on that. Obviously, all of this is set to change come October when the new codex comes out and will be awarded with a bevy of new Space Marine supplements. So everyone who's excited about having just nonstop Space Marine releases for the last year, I hope you're excited about getting nonstop Space Marine releases for the coming year too. So that's going to be a real good time for everyone. Yay! More Space Marines. So thanks for watching, everybody. I think this is going to be an interesting video to look back on in a couple months once we receive the full 9th edition rollout of new Marine rules and see how far we were off, basically, and how different the meta has shifted, whether Salamanders are still going to be near the top, whether the Space Wolves are still going to be putting out results once they become a supplement faction rather than their own codex. I think it's really going to be a tumultuous time for Space Marine players out there. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I do want to give a big shout out to my patrons over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Big thanks for them for supporting the channel. And if you want to support the channel as well, you can join them and get all sorts of goodies like exclusive videos, early access to public videos, and early access to T5S2 pods, which are launching now. So if you head on over to the community Discord in the link in the description, you can join there, and you can join the pod waitlists to get added to a pod as soon as new ones start on a weekly basis. However, patrons will get early access to those and bumped to the top of the waitlist. So really appreciative of all of the patrons of Tactical Tortoise and everyone who has chosen to take time out of the day to watch this beautiful video. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good one. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.